Hear that? A Russian sewing machine is flying. That's how German soldiers in the trenches would laugh when they heard the rattling of a plywood biplane in the night. They considered it a propaganda joke, an annoying nuisance that kept them from sleeping. But they were laughing at their future nightmare, at a weapon that would not just kill them, but methodically drive them insane. In this film, we will show how a group of young women, who at first weren't even taken seriously by their own side, turned their flying coffin into a ruthless night phantom for which the Luftwaffe elite would organize special hunts. This is the story of how the German command began awarding Iron Crosses for the destruction of a crop duster, and how the regiment itself flew more than 23,000 combat missions, becoming the most decorated female unit in world history. In the rule book of any pilot, in any army in the world, there's an unshakable rule. If the plane is on fire in the air, abandon the aircraft immediately. The crew's life is more valuable than a piece of metal, wood, or fabric. It's an axiom. But the night witches had their own unwritten axiom. A plane is not a piece of wood. It is your friend, your comrade, your only protection in the icy void, and you will not abandon it, ever. Tatiana Makarova and her navigator Vera Bellick were inseparable, friends on the ground, a single organism in the sky. They understood each other without words, by the slightest movement, by a breath. They had hundreds of combat missions behind them. That night, everything was going as usual. Approach the target, silent glide, drop the bombs, and just as they were turning to head home, they were hit by an incendiary shell. It hit the wing squarely, right next to the fuel tank. A bright flash, and the flames greedily latched onto the oil-soaked fabric. In seconds, the fire engulfed the entire wing. The cockpit filled with acrid, suffocating smoke. On the ground, a German anti-aircraft gunner lowered his binoculars with satisfaction. "It's burning. She's ours now." He watched as the plane turned into a fireball, waiting for two dark figures with parachutes to jump out. But no one jumped. Instead, the unthinkable happened. The burning plane wasn't falling. It leveled out and continued to fly, straight towards their position. In the cockpit, choking on smoke, Tatiana Makarova fought with the controls. The flames were getting closer. The heat was unbearable. Vera Bellick could have jumped. She had a chance, but she didn't even try. She was helping her friend, trying to beat back the fire, guiding her with her voice through the smoke and the roar of the flames. What drove them in those final moments? An order? Duty? No. It was something more. They were one with their aircraft. They couldn't abandon it, just as they couldn't abandon a wounded comrade on the battlefield. Their mission was to get the plane back to their own territory, to save it, or die with it. The German gunners watched, frozen in horror and amazement. The burning torch wasn't just flying, it was flying at them. They thought it was a ramming attack, that these insane Russian girls had decided to take them with them. In a panic, they scattered. But it wasn't a ramming attack. It was a final, desperate attempt to do their duty. To the very end, Tatiana and Vera burned alive. Their plane crashed just a few hundred meters from the front line, almost on their own soil. They didn't make it. For the German soldiers who later approached the smoldering wreckage, it was a shock. They couldn't understand the logic, the fanaticism. Why? Why didn't they jump? It didn't fit into their pragmatic, soldierly mindset. It was beyond comprehension. Madness. But it wasn't madness. It was the highest degree of loyalty. Loyalty to duty, to friendship, to their war machine. They were not suicide pilots. They were soldiers, and they fought until the last second of their lives. not for an order, but for their plane. Their act, like dozens of others, became part of the legend of girls who were made not of flesh and blood, but of steel and fire. A legend that inspired not just fear in the enemy, but awe. Awe at a strength of spirit that couldn't be burned, shot down, or understood. It could only be destroyed, but never defeated. Every regiment has its brain, a person who doesn't just follow orders, but sees the entire picture of the battle, who plots the routes, finds the weak spots in the enemy's defense, and turns risk into a calculated tactical operation. In the 46th Guards, that brain was Zhenya Rudneva. She wasn't just a navigator. Before the war, she was a student at Moscow State University's Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics, an astronomer. She dreamed of studying the stars, but the war forced her to study the flashes of explosions on the dark earth. Her mind, sharp and mathematically precise, was the regiment's main weapon. She knew the sky, and she knew how to use it for her purposes. The girls loved her, for her quiet voice, her calm confidence, for the fact that a route plotted by Zhenya was the safest and the most accurate. She was their talisman, their sister. In the spring of 1944, during her 645th combat mission, her plane was shot down over the Kerch Peninsula. An anti-aircraft shell, a direct hit. No chance. When the news of her death reached the airfield, the regiment froze. This wasn't just another loss. It was as if the heart had been ripped from a living organism. The pain was unbearable, physical. Raisa Aronova, her best friend, upon hearing of the tragedy, silently lay down on her bed, faced the wall, and remained there for several hours. No one dared to disturb her. A heavy, oppressive silence settled over the regiment. But then the silence was replaced by rage, cold, all-consuming. Grief turned into a personal vendetta. The pilot, Olga Prokopieva, preparing for a night flight, walked over to the female armorers. She took a piece of chalk and, on the smooth black side of a 100-kilogram bomb, wrote in large, uneven letters, "For Zhenya." She didn't say a word. She just looked at the armorers, and they understood everything. They inscribed the next bomb themselves. "For our Zhenya." That night, the witches' attacks changed. This was no longer just tactics. It was revenge. Each crew, approaching a target, wasn't looking for depots or crossings. They were looking for anti-aircraft batteries. They hunted them down, approaching from different directions, dropping their deadly cargo with a single thought. This is for her. On the ground, the Germans felt this change. The attacks became even more ferocious, even more precise, as if they were aiming not just at a square on a map, but personally at each and every one of them, as if behind every explosion stood not a faceless war machine, but someone's personal hatred. This was no longer a war of attrition. This was retribution. The girls were taking revenge not on orders, but from the bottom of their hearts. They were avenging a life cut short, a dream unfulfilled, the fact that their Zhenya would never again see the stars she so loved. They turned the sky into their own courtroom, and the verdict was delivered with fire. The death of Zhenya Rudneva did not break them. It made them stronger. It turned their pain into a weapon. Now, in every flight, in every turn, in every bomb dropped, there was a piece of her soul, a piece of that cold fury that is born when the most precious thing you have is taken away. The enemy had killed their sister, and they made him pay for it, 100-fold. War isn't just fire from the sky and the roar of explosions. Sometimes the most terrifying ordeal is silence, a silence filled with the anticipation of death. The crew of Nina Ulyanenko and Rufina Gasheva was returning from a mission. They had already crossed the front line. Their home airfield was just minutes away. And in that moment, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. A severed oil line. The plane began to lose altitude rapidly. Below, an inky, unfamiliar darkness. Nina, wrestling with the controls, searched for any flat piece of ground. There, a dark patch that looked like a field. She steered the plane towards it. A hard landing, the crack of breaking landing gear, a screech. And then, silence. They were alive. A little battered, frightened, but alive. They climbed out of the cockpit. Not a soul in sight. No man's land. Somewhere ahead, their own troops. Somewhere behind, the Germans. They had to wait for dawn. They crawled into the nearest shell crater, huddled together for warmth, and began to wait. When the first gray rays of light touched the earth, Rufina peeked out of the crater, and her heart stopped. The entire field around them was dotted with small, barely noticeable mounds. The triggers of detonators poked out from the ground. They were sitting in the very center of a German minefield. Now they understood why this patch of land had been so flat and untouched. They realized what a miracle had saved them during the landing. The plane's landing gear, sliding across the ground, had miraculously missed every single mine. And then began the longest day of their lives. Movement meant death. Any careless step, any loud sound could be their last. They froze in their crater, turning to stone. Don't breathe, don't move, just wait. The most terrifying thing wasn't the threat of an explosion. The most terrifying thing was the tension. Absolute stillness, when every muscle in your body is screaming in pain. A silence broken only by the whistling of the wind and the thunderous beat of their own hearts in their ears. They saw German patrols moving in the distance. They heard their guttural speech. The Germans knew their plane had crashed somewhere here. Maybe they had survived, but the Germans weren't in a hurry. The minefield would finish the job. They just had to wait. The sun crawled slowly across the sky. They were suffering from thirst, but couldn't move to get their flasks. Then night came again, cold and full of rustling sounds. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a night bird made them flinch. It sounded like footsteps, that they were about to be discovered. They spent 2 days in that crater, 2 eternities, on the verge of madness from the tension and fear. This wasn't a battle where you could act, shoot, defend yourself. This was the passive waiting for death, in complete silence. On the 3rd day, their own men spotted them. Scouts. The rescue operation was long and agonizing. Sappers, probe by probe, cleared a narrow path to them. Every step of the rescuers echoed thunderously in their hearts. When they were let out, they couldn't walk. Their legs wouldn't obey. But they were alive. This episode never made it into the combat reports. No medals were awarded for it. But for Nina and Rufina, it became the most terrifying memory of the war. They understood a simple, cruel truth. Sometimes the enemy isn't a man with a gun. Sometimes the enemy is the very ground beneath your feet, and you can't defeat it with the force of weapons, but only with the strength of spirit, and with absolute, inhuman patience. 1944 gave way to 1945. The war crossed the border of the Reich. Now the night witches were bombing not their own land, but foreign soil. Beneath their wings, they saw the lights of Polish cities, and then German ones. It was the final act of the tragedy. They drove the enemy westward. They liberated Belarus, Poland. Behind them were the Caucasus, Crimea, Sevastopol. They had seen so much death, so many ruined cities, that it seemed their hearts should have turned to stone. But they carried within them the memory of every fallen friend, of every empty bed in the barracks, And this memory drove them forward. Now they weren't just soldiers. They were an instrument of vengeance. Their attacks on German columns retreating to Berlin were filled with a cold, methodical fury. They struck the enemy in its own lair. The German resistance was desperate. The air defenses around the cities were dense, layered. But the witches, hardened by hundreds of nocturnal duels, had learned to bypass them too. They slipped through the flak like water through fingers and delivered their precise, painful strikes. The war was rolling towards its logical conclusion, and in this death agony of the Reich, the unthinkable began to happen. Respect, reluctant, extracted by force, but respect nonetheless. In one of the downed German fighters, the pilot survived. During interrogation, he was defiant, arrogant. He was an ace, part of the elite, and he spoke with contempt about the Soviet Air Force. The interrogator asked him who, in his opinion, caused them the most trouble in this sector. The pilot answered without hesitation, "The night bombers. They gave us no peace on the ground or at our airfields. Very brave and skillful pilots." Then the interrogator placed several photographs in front of him. They showed the girls from the regiment, smiling, so very young, in their tunics and pilot caps. "Here," said the interrogator, "are your brave pilots." The German ace stared at the photographs for a long time. His expression changed. The arrogance vanished, replaced first by disbelief and then by shock. He looked up. "I can't believe it. I can't believe that these brave pilots who kept us awake so many nights were these young girls. They deserve the highest honors and the highest respect." It was an admission of defeat, not a military one, that was still weeks away, but a moral one. The entire Nazi ideology, built on the supremacy of the Aryan race and the power of weapons, collapsed in that moment. It shattered against the resilience of these girls, against their skill, against their will. They had made it. From the steppes beyond the Volga to the very heart of Germany. They brought the war back to where it began. And the enemy, who first laughed at them, then feared them, and then hated them, was finally forced to acknowledge their strength. For the pilots, it was a grim triumph. They flew over a foreign, hostile land, and on every mission, they mentally recited the names of those who didn't make it back. For Lyuba, for Vera, for Zhenya, for all of them. The war was almost won, but they kept flying, every night, until the very last day. May 1945. The air smelled of spring and gunpowder. The war was in its death throes, snarling with its final salvos. Berlin had fallen, but isolated German units continued their desperate, senseless resistance. For the 406th Guards Regiment, these were just ordinary combat nights. They were operating near Swinemünde, bombing the enemy's retreating columns. They had become so accustomed to war that they couldn't imagine any other life. A life without the roar of engines, without the whistle of wind in their ears, without the icy knot of fear in their stomachs before every flight. On the night of May 7th to 8th, they went on a mission, as always. No one knew that this would be their last mission. They hit their targets, turned around, and headed for home. And when they returned to the airfield, they were met with an unusual, excited commotion. The war is over. Those 3 words sounded like an explosion, louder than any bomb. Over. Completely. Forever. First, there was a second of deafening silence, disbelief, and then the airfield erupted. The girls were screaming, crying, laughing, hugging each other. They fired flares into the air, and the night sky, which for so many years had been their battlefield, bloomed with the colorful lights of a victory salute. It was euphoria, happiness, relief. We survived. We won. But as the first rays of sun touched the earth, the euphoria began to fade, and in its place came something else. Raisa Aronova, a navigator who served through the entire war, later recalled, "Sometimes you'd come back, and your friend's bed would be empty. That was the most terrifying thing. Not the battle itself, but the silence that followed. And now, on the morning of victory, that silence became absolute. It was no longer temporary. It was eternal. The empty beds in the barracks would never be filled again." The girls walked through the regiment's quarters, looking at the photographs on the wall. There was Lyuba Olkovskaya, who burned to death at the very beginning. There was Zhenya Rudneva, their brilliant one, their astronomer. There was Tanya Makarova and Vera Belik, the fiery arrow. 32 girls, 32 lives cut short. The joy of victory mingled with the sharp, piercing pain of loss. They had won, yes, but at what cost? They looked at each other, grown up, with tired eyes in which the shadow of war was forever frozen. They had survived, but a part of their souls would forever remain there, in the night sky, with those who did not return. On the German positions that night, silence also fell. The soldiers, exhausted, broken, climbed out of their trenches and just listened to the silence. "They won't be flying anymore," someone said. And in those words, there wasn't just relief, there was also emptiness. Their nightmare was over, the war was over, an entire era was over. But for the witches, it was only the end of the fighting. The war stayed with them forever, in their dreams, in their memories, in this deafening silence that replaced the roar of engines. They had defeated the enemy, but now they had to learn to live with the silence and with the void left by their fallen sisters. The war was over. The roar of cannons was replaced by the silence of peaceful life. The girls took off their greasy overalls and sweat-soaked tunics. They put on dresses again. They returned home. Yesterday's night bombers once again became students, teachers, engineers, mothers. Nadezhda Popova married a fighter pilot she had met at the front. Natalia Meklin became a writer to tell their story to the world. Rufina Gasheva continued her service in the army, rising to the rank of major. They were building a new life, the very one they had fought for. But the sky of war would not let them go. It came at night, bursting into their dreams with the roar of engines and flashes of searchlights. They would wake up in a cold sweat, instinctively trying to find the control stick or the bomb release. They could leave the war, but the war would not leave them. The enemies they had defeated also remembered. For German veterans, the Nachthexen remained a legend forever, a myth, a real-life nightmare that haunted them for years. They became part of military history, an example of asymmetric warfare studied in academies. Their tactics were analyzed in minute detail. Their phenomenon was something people tried to explain, but it was impossible to truly understand them without looking into their hearts. They survived to remember not only the battles and victories, to remember the faces, the smiles, the voices of their friends who remained forever 20 years old. In one of her last letters home, Zhenya Rudneva, an astronomy student who dreamed of studying galaxies, wrote simple, piercing words to her mother. "Mama, I believe in our victory. I see it as clearly as the stars in the sky that I love so much. And if I am fated to die, know this: I died for these stars, for our sky. She perished for her sky, for her stars." Decades passed. Gray-haired, stooped old women, covered in military medals, would gather on Victory Day. They remembered, they laughed, and they cried. And every one of them, raising her eyes to the night sky, saw not just a scattering of distant lights. They saw Zhenya Rudneva's stars. In every shimmering light, they recognized the faces of their fallen sisters. Every star was a soul that did not return from a combat mission. They were watching them from the sky, just like back then, during the war, when they flew side by side, wing to wing. They were made of wood and fabric, but their will was made of steel. They started as a propaganda joke, a less than serious threat the enemy laughed at. But they ended the war as a legend, the most decorated female unit in world history. Their story is not just a story about war, it's a story of how contempt breeds will, how weakness, multiplied by courage, becomes an unbreakable force, and how, even in the darkest night, there is always a place for stars. You just have to lift your head and look at the sky. They are there, and they are watching us, always. October, 1941. The cold wind of the Trans-Volga steppe chills you to the bone. At an airfield in Engels, hundreds of girls stand frozen in a ragged formation. Yesterday's students, agronomists, teachers, wrapped in coarse soldiers' uniforms that hang on them like sacks. Before them stands their commander, Yevdokiya Bershanskaya, a woman with a quiet voice and a steel gaze. Her words cut through the frosty air. Girls, remember, you are not just pilots, you are soldiers, and a soldier has no right to tears or fear. Leave fear on the ground. There is no place for it in the sky. They listen, and a fire burns in their eyes, the fire of faith. Faith that they are needed, that they are a real weapon. This chance was given to them by the legendary Marina Raskova, a tenacious, famous pilot who managed to convince Stalin himself. She achieved the impossible, the creation of 3 female air regiments. And now these girls, her chosen ones, had to prove that this was not a mistake, that they were worthy. But outside their airfield, in the headquarters where stern generals smoked their cigarettes, no one believed in it. A propaganda stunt, a nice gesture to raise morale. Nothing more. Even their own side didn't take them seriously. To the male command, they were a joke, an oddity, women who decided to play at war, and their weapon only amplified this ridicule. Their war machine was not forged from duralumin, like the fearsome Il-2 ground attack aircraft. It was stitched together from pine slats, plywood, and percal, a dense fabric coated with varnish. Their plane was the U-2, a training flying desk designed to forgive rookie mistakes, not to survive anti-aircraft fire. It could barely reach a speed of 120 kilometers per hour. This was a speed at which a German Messerschmitt would simply stall, unable to even aim properly. But it was also a death sentence. It was impossible to escape a fighter at that speed. The plane had nothing that made it a combat vehicle. No armor to protect from a bullet. No radio to call for help. No serious weaponry. Only primitive bomb racks under the fragile lower wings. It was in these flying coffins that they were expected to fight. Girls whose average age was barely over 20. An accelerated training course. Just 6 months instead of the standard several years. 6 months to turn a schoolgirl into a night bomber. Skepticism hung in the air. It was in the condescending smiles of the male pilots, in the orders that sent their regiment to the most secondary sectors of the front. German intelligence, reporting on the formation of a female unit, probably just had a good laugh. The Soviets are desperate. They're putting little girls in plywood biplanes. This is the beginning of the end. But Bershanskaya looked into the eyes of her subordinates, and she saw what the generals in their headquarters did not. She saw a fierce desire to prove themselves, to avenge their fathers and brothers, their burned cities. She saw a stubbornness that was stronger than any armor. They knew they were considered a mistake. They knew their every flight would be scrutinized under a microscope, with everyone expecting them to fail. But it was precisely this contempt that became their main fuel, their secret weapon. The world considered them a less than serious threat, and they were about to prove to the whole world just how wrong it was. June 1942, the Southern Front. Night covers the scorched steppe with a thick, inky blanket. In the German trenches, reeking of gunpowder and damp earth, soldiers try to snatch a few hours of restless sleep. And suddenly, a sound is born in the silence. A strange, intermittent sound, unlike anything else. As if someone in the sky started the engine of an old lawnmower. Putter, 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 putter. It approaches slowly, hesitantly, without the predatory roar of a Messerschmitt or the heavy drone of a Junkers. A veteran, leaning against the trench wall, opens one eye and smirks. Hear that, Hans? The Russian sewing machine is flying. Laughter ripples through the trench. This sound already has many names. The coffee grinder, the midnight seamstress, Russ plywood. For German soldiers, accustomed to the technological superiority of the Luftwaffe, this sound is a symbol of the Red Army's desperation, proof that the Soviets have run out of real planes. But on the other side of that sound, in the icy emptiness of the sky, no one was laughing. In the open cockpit, buffeted by the wind, sat two girls. The pilot, gripping the control stick with numb fingers, flew the machine at an extremely low altitude. The navigator, bent over a map, illuminated it with the dim light of a flashlight, shielding it with her hand so the enemy wouldn't see. Every flight was a lesson, written in risk and adrenaline. They learned to read the night landscape like an open book. They learned to be a shadow, a ghost. They knew their plane was defenseless, that their only weapons were the night, surprise, and precision. There it is. The target, a small ammunition depot, camouflaged at a crossroads. The pilot smoothly eases off the throttle, and the puttering sound of the engine fades, replaced by a tense silence. Now, the aircraft is a silent glider. It glides in the darkness, and the only sound that accompanies it is the quiet whisper of the wind flowing over its fabric wings. On the ground, the soldiers freeze. The sound is gone. Where did it go? They peer into the starless sky but see nothing. And at that moment, the navigator, leaning over the side, pulls the bomb release cable. The explosions weren't deafening. 50-kilogram bombs couldn't level a fortified area. They left small craters, could damage a truck, set a haystack on fire. For the Germans, it was more of an annoyance than real damage. Another reason for contemptuous jokes in the morning. Those noisy things again. Won't let us sleep. But they didn't understand the main point. The target wasn't just the bomb itself. The target was their sleep, their peace, their nerves. Night after night, flight after flight, the girls honed their skills. They learned to appear out of nowhere. And one night, an experienced Feldwebel, hearing that strange whisper from the sky just before an explosion, found a new name for them. He told his comrades, "Those aren't sewing machines. They glide through the sky without a sound, like witches on broomsticks. Nachthexen, night witches." The nickname, born of mockery and irritation, stuck to them instantly. The Germans were still laughing, but new notes were already creeping into their laughter. Notes of anxiety. They weren't afraid yet, but they were beginning to hate that sound. And even more, the silence that followed it. And back at the airfield, after returning from a flight, the girls would collapse from exhaustion. They didn't know yet that the enemy had given them a a name that would very soon become their banner, a name that would be spoken in the trenches not with laughter, but with superstitious terror. Until the spring of 1942, war was just a theory to them. A difficult, exhausting theory, but a theory nonetheless. They learned to fly, memorized maps, and mounted practice bombs. They lost friends in training flights. It was painful, but these were tragic accidents, crashes. A real war, it seemed, smelled different. And now, here they were, at the front. Their first combat missions were behind them. They had already heard the whistle of shrapnel, seen the flashes of anti-aircraft bursts. Youthful fervor had not yet faded from their minds. It mixed with adrenaline and the first taste of real combat. They returned to the airfield, exhilarated, with burning eyes, and shared their experiences. They felt invincible. They were young. That night, as usual, their U-2s left the airfield one by one, disappearing into the darkness. Among them was the plane of Squadron Commander Lyubov Olkovskaya and her navigator, Vera Tarasova. Olkovskaya was one of the most experienced, self-confident pilots. The others looked up to her. She was an example. In the sky, they were met by the icy, predatory tentacles of German searchlights. They darted through the blackness, trying to snatch the slow-moving prey from it. It was a familiar, deadly game. Slip between the beams, complete the mission, and get away. But this time, the game didn't go according to the rules. A single tracer round, fired from the ground, found its target. It didn't pierce non-existent armor. It just grazed the fabric skin of the wing. A small, almost invisible spark. But that spark was enough. The plywood and percal, soaked in varnish, ignited not like wood, but like gunpowder. In a single instant, the plane turned into a blazing torch. On the ground, by the anti-aircraft gun, the German crew erupted in cheers of delight. A hit! It's burning! For them, it was an easy victory. One of those annoying sewing machines had gotten what it deserved. Tomorrow night would be quieter. Their commander would pat them on the back, maybe recommend them for a medal. It proved a simple truth. The sky belonged to them, and these amateurs in their plywood biplanes were just an annoying misunderstanding that would soon be over. But in the sky, in the cockpits of the other planes, their friends watched in horror as a flaming arrow plummeted toward the earth. Someone cried out. Someone froze, forgetting how to breathe. The first thought, a desperate, foolish hope. That's not one of ours. It's a German. They shot down a German. But they knew. They saw the familiar silhouette engulfed in flames. They saw the plane of their commander, their friend, falling, leaving a terrible, fiery streak across the night sky. On the airfield, the news spread instantly. The girls waiting for their turn to take off looked in the direction where the plane was burning out and said nothing. Yevdokiya Bershanskaya, their commander, gave a curt, lifeless order. Continue the sorties, get to work. And they worked. They took off, they bombed, they returned. But something had changed forever. The war was no longer an adventure. It had shown its true face, ruthless, ugly, devouring lives. This wasn't a drill. They were being killed, and each of them, climbing into the sky, now knew she might not come back. But in the morning, when the gray dawn broke through into the barracks, it all became real. 2 beds were empty. Their neatly made blankets seemed like a deafening mockery. Their belongings lay as if their owners had just stepped out for a minute and would be back at any moment. But they didn't come back. Youth had burned away that night, along with Olkovskaya's plane. In its place came a cold, ringing emptiness and grief. a grief that couldn't be shown with tears, but which now lived in their eyes, in their silence, in the way they now gripped the control stick. This was no longer a game. This was a job, and revenge. Fear is a teacher, a harsh, ruthless, but the best one of all. After the first losses, the pilots understood. Their only chance was to become invisible, inaudible, to turn into a night whisper, followed by death. They honed their tactics to perfection, to an art form. Several kilometers from the target, the engine was throttled back to idle. The clatter of the sewing machine would die down, and the plane would begin to glide in silence, a silent shadow against the stars. It was this whisper that became their calling card, their main tactical advantage. On the ground, the Germans heard only the soft whistle of the wind in the wing braces, a sound like the sweep of a broom. They nicknamed them the Night Witches, never suspecting how accurately it described their method. If they can't hear you, they can't hit you. Silence became their armor, but silence didn't protect them from random fire, from a stray bullet. On one such night, Nadezhda Popova was working in the skies over enemy territory, a routine sortie, a routine target. But this time, something went wrong. She didn't see where the shots came from. Suddenly, the plane just shuddered, as if it had hit an invisible wall. Then again, and again. The sound of tearing fabric, the crack of splintering wood. Her U-2 was riddled with holes. The instruments failed. The controls went soft, the plane barely responding. She knew she wouldn't make it back to the airfield. The only chance was to land in an open field, on her own territory, if she was lucky. She pushed on until the last moment. Every meter was a struggle. The engine coughed, sputtering, but she forced it to work, forced the plane to fly. She spoke to it as if it were a living thing. "Hold on, little swallow, hold on, my dear." And it held on. She saw a flat field below and crashed down onto it, skidding for several dozen meters. Silence. She climbed out of the cockpit, her arms and legs trembling. She looked over her plane. It looked like a sieve. There were holes in the wings you could stick your head through. How it had stayed in the air at all was a mystery. And at that moment, she heard the sound of another engine. Another U-2, just as battered and lame, was coming in to land next to her. It landed just as hard. Two girls climbed out of the cockpit. One of them was her friend. They stood in the middle of the field, under the indifferent light of the moon. Two surviving crews out of the 4 that didn't return to base that night. They just walked toward each other, and without a word, they hugged and cried. From the horror they had endured, from the joy of being alive, from the bitterness for those who weren't so lucky. At the German positions that night, they celebrated a victory. A few more of those witches shot down. Their numbers were dwindling, but they didn't know that those who returned were becoming different. Every such flight, every survival on the edge of impossible, turned yesterday's girls into hardened, deadly professionals. They learned to feel their plane as if it were their own body. They were learning to fly into the very heart of the fire and come out alive. They no longer feared the fire. They were learning to slip through it. On the ground, in the German trenches, a new, irrational feeling was growing. Explosions. But from where? I heard nothing. No plane, no shots. They appear out of nowhere, as if materializing from the night air itself. This was no longer just an annoyance. It was unease, uncertainty. The seeds of fear, sown by a quiet whisper in the night, were beginning to sprout their first, poisonous shoots. One bomb, dropped from a plywood biplane, is a nuisance. 2 bombs are a problem. But what about 10, 12, 15 waves of bombers in a single night. That's not tactics anymore. That's psychological torture. And it was this torture that the female pilots turned into their main weapon. They called it the conveyor belt. The night was just beginning. At the front line, a German soldier, exhausted from the day's battle, was finishing his meager dinner and lighting a cigarette. He dreamed of a few hours of sleep. And just then, a familiar, hated sound drifted from the distance. Chug, chug, chug. The siren. Everyone to cover. A U-2 passed over their positions, dropped its 2 bombs, and flew away. The explosions died down. The all clear. Time to breathe again. The soldiers crawled out of their trenches, brushing themselves off. Some cursed, others laughed nervously, but they barely had time to light another cigarette before the wail of the siren returned. And again, the chugging sound. And again, the explosions. And so it went, every 5 to 10 minutes, all night, without a break. It was an idea brilliant in its simplicity and cruelty. A single U-2 carried only 200, 300 kilograms of bombs at most, but in one night, it could fly up to 15 sorties. The regiment became a swarm. While one squadron bombed the target, a second was on approach, a third was already taking off from the airfield, and a fourth was being hastily rearmed on the ground. This non-stop cycle turned the night into a personal hell for those on the ground. Sleep became an impossible luxury. Any attempt to fall asleep was shattered by the wail of a siren. Any attempt to repair a damaged tank or help the wounded was illuminated by the flashes of new explosions. Nerves, stretched to their breaking point, began to snap. The soldiers became angry, jumpy, their combat effectiveness plummeting catastrophically. They were going mad from powerlessness and chronic sleep deprivation. But this conveyor belt had another, unseen side. At the airfield, just a few kilometers from the front, another, no less furious battle was raging. The female mechanics. Small, thin girls in greasy overalls. Their hands were black with grease and chapped raw from the frost. It was on their shoulders that this conveyor of death rested. As soon as a plane taxied to a halt, they would rush to it. One would refuel the tank from a bucket through a chamois filter. Another would inspect the engine. And the 2 strongest would haul the bombs. 100-kilogram bombs. 50-kilogram bombs. The 2 of them, straining with all their might, grunting, would lift the deadly cargo and hang it on the racks under the wings. No winches, no mechanization, only their hands. And so it went, 10, 12, 15 times a night, for a single plane. And there were dozens of planes in the regiment. The pilot and navigator barely had time to jump out of the cockpit, drink a mug of hot tea, and run back to the waiting, ready machine. They were dropping from exhaustion. Their eyes were gluing shut. But they knew, down there, on the ground, the enemy had to suffer more. This thought, this cold fury, drove them into the sky again and again. They had their own ritual. Before every flight, the mechanics would hug their pilots. And then, when the pilots were already in the cockpit, they would walk up to the plane and kiss it. Literally. They would kiss the cold fabric of the fuselage or the engine cowling, and they would whisper the same plea. Bring them back. Please, bring them back alive. They were a single organism, those who flew and those who stayed on the ground. Their shared exhaustion, their shared pain, and their shared hatred fueled this relentless nightly conveyor. For the German command, this became a serious problem. The morale of the frontline troops was melting away with each sleepless night. Contempt for the sewing machines gave way to desperation. It never ends. An explosion just goes off, and the siren wails again. We haven't slept for 3 nights. They're going to drive us into our graves. They didn't yet know that their command would soon concede the truth of these words and declare a real, elite hunt for these night phantoms. Bewilderment reigned in the headquarters of the German army. Reports from the front were becoming more and more alarming. And it wasn't about material damage. A dozen destroyed trucks, a blown-up warehouse. These were drops in the ocean of war. The problem was deeper. It was hidden in the reports of regimental doctors about the rise in nervous breakdowns among personnel, in the reports of commanders about the catastrophic drop in morale in units subjected to the night raids. Soldiers, hardened in the battles for Europe, were breaking. They weren't afraid of death. They were afraid of the night. The Wehrmacht generals, accustomed to thinking in terms of steel and fire, were faced with something irrational, with a weapon that struck not at tanks, but at the psyche, with a threat that couldn't be measured in tons of dropped bombs. And this threat came from girls, in plywood biplanes. At first, it seemed humiliating to admit that a training plane, which in Germany was used for little more than leisure flights, had become a real tactical problem, was beyond them. But the facts were stubborn. The Night Witches, a nickname now uttered without a hint of a smirk, had become a symbol of insomnia, fear, and powerlessness. And so, the German command made an unprecedented decision. A new order was issued to the night fighter squadrons of the Luftwaffe, the elite of the elite, a priority target. For every U-2 plane from the women's regiment shot down, the pilot would be nominated for the Reich's highest military honor, the Iron Cross. The Iron Cross, a symbol of Prussian valor, an award given for shooting down Allied flying fortresses, for wiping out squadrons of Soviet attack planes, for sinking ships. Now, it was being promised for the destruction of a plane made of wood and fabric, for a victory over a girl whose only defensive maneuver was to glide just above the ground. This wasn't just an acknowledgement. It was a capitulation to their tactics. The German war machine, unable to cope with the psychological pressure, decided to respond in the only way it understood, with brute force. For Luftwaffe aces like Oberleutnant Josef Kochok, it became a matter of honor. The hunt was on. But they very quickly realized that this would be the most difficult hunt of their careers. They were elusive, one of them later admitted. Shooting down one of these witches was incredibly difficult. They flew so low that our radar couldn't see them, and their speed was so slow that when I tried to get on their tail, my Messerschmitt would lose control and risk going into a stall. I had to attack on a flyby, with only a split second to aim. For the female pilots, the news of the award was the ultimate recognition. They learned about it from leaflets the Germans dropped on their airfield. Brave pilots, come over to our side. We guarantee you life and chocolate. Your command is sending you to certain death. They laughed as they read the leaflets. An Iron Cross for their heads. It meant one thing. They were doing everything right. They weren't just a nuisance. They were a real threat. A threat the enemy had valued with its highest award. Girls, we've been recognized, their commander, Bershanskaya, told them. And her voice was filled with unconcealed pride. From a propaganda curiosity, from a flying misunderstanding, they had turned into guardsmen, an elite target for elite hunters. The enemy's contempt had turned to hatred, and hatred is a form of respect, the most sincere, the most honest kind, paid for with fear. From that moment on, every one of their flights was not just a combat mission. It was a duel of plywood against steel, courage against technology, and they accepted this challenge. Now they knew their worth, and that worth was an Iron Cross. When winter came, The pilots had a new enemy. Merciless, impersonal, it pierced them to the core. This enemy was more fearsome than German anti-aircraft guns and night fighters. Its name was Frost. Their U-2 was not designed for flying in the winter cold. The open cockpit became an ice trap. The wind, rushing towards them at 100 kilometers per hour in temperatures of -20, -30 degrees, felt like a stream of liquid nitrogen. It burned their faces, seeped under their fur-lined flight suits, and froze their movements. The instruments were coated in frost just minutes after takeoff. The windscreen turned into an opaque sheet of ice, and they had to constantly stick their heads out just to see anything at all. Their eyelashes froze together. Their breath turned into a cloud of vapor that immediately settled as a crust of ice on their collars. But the flights never stopped. Not for a single night. The conveyor of death had to keep running, regardless of the weather. On the ground, in their dugouts, German soldiers huddled in blankets next to red-hot makeshift stoves. They were certain, in this kind of weather, not even birds would fly. Their equipment was freezing. Their engines wouldn't start. Finally, they could get some sleep. But an hour passed, then another, and through the howl of the blizzard, they would once again hear that hated sound, muffled by the storm. Chug, chug, chug. It can't be. They can't be flying in this frost. They're not human. This was no longer fear. It was a superstitious terror. In their minds, the night witches were finally transforming into mythical, supernatural beings, impervious to bullets and the elements. And at that very moment, in the sky, Nina Raspopova was piloting her plane toward the target. Her feet in their heavy fur boots had long since lost all feeling. She simply couldn't feel them. She knew it was frostbite, but right now, that didn't matter. The main thing was to reach the target, to drop the bombs, and to return. When she landed, she was carried from the cockpit. She couldn't stand. In the medical bay, they tried to take off her boots, but they wouldn't come off. They were frozen to her legs. They were pulled off by force, along with her skin. The pain was hellish, but Nina didn't scream. She only gritted her teeth. The doctor, treating her wounds, said she could forget about flying. For a long time, maybe forever. That evening, as the regiment prepared for new sorties, Nina, limping, overcoming inhuman pain, came to the airfield. She walked up to her plane. The mechanics begged her to stay. Her commander forbade her to go, but she looked at them with a gaze that held nothing but granite determination. The pain will pass, but an unfulfilled order remains forever. The motherland is more important than my legs. And she climbed into the cockpit. They helped her. She couldn't press the pedals herself, but she flew. And that night, she completed several more combat missions. This was not just courage. This was a resilience beyond human comprehension. The female technicians warmed the engines with blowtorches. Burning their hands, they cleared the wings of ice. By touch, in the dark, they hung the frozen, slippery bombs. And they saw their friends off into a frozen hell, knowing they might not return, not from enemy fire, but simply from freezing to death in mid-flight. Every night was a feat of bravery. Every landing, a miracle. They fought not only the enemy, but nature itself. And they were victorious. Victorious because their will was hotter than any fire and harder than any ice. This inhuman resilience struck awe and terror into the enemy. They couldn't understand where these fragile girls drew their strength from. They didn't know they were warmed by hatred and love for the land that was freezing beneath them, and which they had sworn to liberate. At any cost. Summer, 1943. The sky over Kuban had become a death trap, The German command, tired of the impotence of its anti-aircraft artillery, threw its most advanced night weapon against the Witches, specialized interceptor fighters. These were twin-engine Messerschmitt 110s, heavy, fast machines equipped with onboard Liechtenstein radars. They were the eyes of the Luftwaffe in the dead of night. Their pilots, night aces, the best of the best. They didn't search for targets visually. They saw blips on their radar screens. For the Witches, this meant the end of their main advantage, invisibility. Their wooden planes hardly reflected radio waves, but a fighter that got close enough could detect them. And then, the hunter appeared in the sky. His name was Joseph Kochiok, Oberleutnant, one of the most successful night aces. He didn't chase single planes. He studied their tactics. He figured out their routes, their air trails that they used to fly to the target and back. And he set up ambushes. He didn't attack from the tail like a normal fighter. He used the Schräge Musik weapon system, cannons mounted in the fuselage, firing upwards at an angle. He would approach under the slow-moving U-2 into its blind spot where he couldn't be seen. He would position himself below, where his silhouette was indistinguishable against the dark ground. He would catch the defenseless fabric belly in his sights and fire a short burst. August 1st, 1943. This night would be forever seared into the regiment's memory with black fire. The first crew went on a mission and didn't return at the scheduled time. At the airfield, this caused alarm, but not panic. Delays happened. Maybe a forced landing. Maybe they got lost. Then the second one didn't return. The radio was silent. The tension mounted. When it became clear that the third crew was also missing, the airfield froze in an icy stupor. The fourth plane, which had gone to the same quadrant, also vanished. 4 crews, 8 girls, dissolved into the night without a single signal, without a single witness. At the command post, Yevdokiya Bershanskaya called out their call signs over and over again. In response, only the crackle of static. She looked at the map, at the quadrant where they had gone. There was no heavy anti-aircraft defense there. What could have happened? What? They waited until dawn, hoping for a miracle. They stared into the paling sky, listening, trying to catch the familiar rattling sound. But the sky was empty and quiet, deafeningly quiet. For the German pilots, it was a triumph. Technology had defeated courage. At last, an antidote to these night phantoms had been found. Ace Joseph Kochok had shot down 4 planes in a single sortie, 4 Iron Crosses in one night. He was a hero. But for the Witches, it was a catastrophe, the most terrible night in their history. They understood. Their invulnerability was over. Now, out there in the dark, there was someone who could see them when they could not see him. An impersonal, invisible threat had transformed into a specific, deadly enemy. The hunter. He didn't just shoot down their planes. He shattered their faith in their own tactics. He sowed fear. Now, taking off, each of them knew, below her, in the velvet blackness, a predator might be lurking. And you wouldn't hear its roar. You wouldn't see the fire from its guns. Your flight would simply be cut short. Suddenly, and forever. The war had moved to a new level. Now it wasn't just a job. It was a hunt, and they were the prey. The hunter in the sky was not the only threat. On the ground, another, no less sophisticated trap awaited them. The Germans called it the light carousel. It was a perfect pen for slow, defenseless prey. Imagine the night. You're flying at an altitude of only a few hundred meters, peering into the barely distinguishable contours of the earth. And suddenly, without warning, you are pierced by a blinding column of light. A single searchlight beam plucks your plane from the darkness, pinning it to the sky like a butterfly to a board. Your heart plummets. For a moment, you are blinded, and then a second beam joins the first, a third, a fourth. They catch you in their crosshairs. You are no longer in the sky. You are on a stage, in the center of a giant cone of light, and millions of eyes are watching you from below. When a searchlight caught you, it was like you were standing naked on a stage. You see nothing but this blinding light, but everyone sees you, and they start shooting. Those are the words of Nadezhda Popova. She knew what she was talking about. As soon as the plane was trapped, all hell broke loose. From all sides, from dozens of positions, anti-aircraft guns opened fire on the illuminated target. 20mm, 37mm. Their tracer shells streaked like multicolored dotted lines toward the center of the dome of light, straight at you. The air around the plane boiled. It filled with the whistling, whining, and clicking of flying shrapnel. The fabric skin ripped like paper from the hits. The wooden frame groaned. Break free. Just break free. The pilot would instinctively throw the machine from side to side. A sharp snake maneuver, a slip on the wing, a series of chaotic, desperate maneuvers. The main thing was not to fly straight, not to let them aim. But the searchlight beams were tenacious. They did not release their victim, following its every move. For the German anti-aircraft gunners, it was the thrill of the hunt. We got her. She's ours. Fire with everything you've got. They saw the small, defenseless bird flitting about in the sky, and they methodically, cold-bloodedly fired at it. It was an almost certain guarantee of victory. A plane caught in the light carousel was doomed, but the witches wouldn't be witches if they hadn't learned to fight this too. They developed their own tactic. They began to work in pairs. The first plane would go in as bait. It would deliberately fly a little higher, a little louder, drawing the attention of the searchlights and gun crews. And while the full force of the air defense was focused on it, the second plane, flying lower, in the shadows, would slip through to the target unnoticed. And its first bombs would fall not on a warehouse or headquarters, but on the anti-aircraft batteries themselves, on the searchlight crews. It was a game of death with negligible chances of success. Every flight into such a zone was voluntary torture, a primal terror that had to be suppressed, driven deep down, so that cold calculation and the will to live could take over. Sometimes they managed to escape. A plane, riddled with holes, its control cables severed, would miraculously tumble out of the cone of light back into the saving darkness. The pilots, deafened, in a state of shock, would guide the crippled machine home on adrenaline alone. They couldn't remember how they landed, but they returned. And each time they returned from this hell of light, they brought back priceless experience. They learned to feel the edge of the beam. They learned to escape the fire at the very last split second. They learned to slip between the beams of death. To the Germans, this was inexplicable. They would see a plane, caught in a pincer, already practically destroyed, suddenly disappear. It would dissolve, as if it had never been there. And this only strengthened their belief that they were not fighting humans, but real witches who commanded the night itself. This story is not just about war. It is a story of how the world's contempt becomes the strongest armor, and how apparent weakness, plywood, fabric, a girl's will, transforms into an indestructible weapon when fueled by fury and loyalty. What makes a person go to certain death not by order, but by the call of the heart? And where is the arsenal that truly wins wars located? in the roar of factories, or in the silence of the human soul. Their story isn't over as long as we remember it. Share your thoughts below. Every comment, every like, and every subscription helps us preserve these voices from the past.